Hello everybody, we are at the London office of the Financial Times with the chief economics commentator of the newspaper, one of the world's leading economists, Martin Wolf. Martin's been on the show many times. Martin, before we went live, you suggested to me that this was your moment, that suddenly economics has become interesting again. Is it because of this tariff thing that a certain Donald Trump has introduced?
Well, there's no doubt that what you describe as this tariff thing has created a novelty, to put it mildly. He's done things that, as far as I can see, have never been done before in the history of economics. So, and we don't normally live through an experience with a set of policies, trade policy, which has been pretty unexciting since the Second World War, and you're suddenly in a different world. And that was not quite what we expected. In addition to that, it's not even as though it's sort of predictably in a different world. Sort of every day or so, it seems to be something different. So in that sense, yes, it's very, very exciting. Now, there are other things going on, obviously, in the administration in other areas, which might turn out to be even more important. The attack on science and the funding of science, for example, the attack on universities. These are all very, very important. The dismantling of important parts of the government, the relationship with allies. But I think this tariff war is remarkable for its scale. We've never seen changes in tariffs at this level before. Its comprehensive nature that basically affects most of the world, and its extraordinary unpredictability. So this is a new world for economists, and we will be studying this, I'm absolutely sure, for half a century or so.
My sense, Martin, one of the reasons you're enjoying it is because you're a natural polemicist and you haven't pulled your punches in your columns. I think you recently wrote one of your last FT pieces that America is inevitably going to lose in this war against China. Is it as dumb as it seems? I mean, you're the chief economist at the chief economics commentator at the FT. You're one of the world's, as I said, most respected economists. You're an expert on this area. Is it just dumb? Are there any coherent economic arguments in favor of tariffs, of what they're doing?
Well, I think there is I've been trying to say this, and I'm planning to write more. There is a genuine problem, and part of that, and part of that is to do with trade and more broadly the balance of payments, which is affecting the US. It's genuine. There's a real set of issues, and economists, including me actually, have been discussing these problems, what you might call basically two problems: the global imbalances problem and the deindustrialization problem. These are two real problems, economic and social. The problem is that it's very hard for me to see how these policies that are now being introduced will solve those problems worldwide, and they are global problems. And the way the war is being pursued, if you like, by the Trump administration is such as, I think, inevitably to lose many of the allies they ought to have in this contest. And therefore they are playing this match, if you like, without the help of lots of people who should be on their side. And I don't think the way they're going about it now will solve that problem. I think it's making it worse. But yes, there are a couple of genuine, real problems, which is perfectly reasonable for them to want to address, if they can do so in a coherent, well-planned, and relatively inclusive way.
Is it a problem with China, essentially, in terms of China producing too much and not buying enough of American goods? Is that the heart of the problem?
I think the problem, China is not the only such country. They are right to observe that Germany has also behaved somewhat in the same way, but Germany's capacity for disruption, though very real in Europe, and I wrote about that in my book on the crisis published about a decade ago, is not global. The rise of China was bound to be a massively disruptive event. How could it not be? Suddenly there's a new peer competitor out there in the world. I don't think we had the right or the capacity to prevent its rise. I would have strongly opposed any such effort, though some people I'm sure would disagree. But China is a vast country with a tremendously capable population and an even more capable government than we thought 20 or 30 years ago. And its rise was going to be very disruptive. Its disruption is for the world. I mean, it's also disrupted Europe a lot. It's disrupted any country that is competing with Chinese manufacturers. Actually, that includes Japan. Japan has been displaced as a manufacturing exporter to a significant degree by China. So it's not just about America. One of the mistakes is to think of it's just about America. The rise of China is a fundamental transformational moment. And there is a specific problem with China, which is that it's been following the general line of East Asian manufacturing-led development. But because it's much bigger and because there are features of its economy, particularly excess savings, which are even larger than in other countries, the disruption is even bigger. So there's a genuine disruptive force here, which we should have started dealing with consistently about 2 decades ago.
My sense is that Trump is trying in his own peculiar way to walk back some of these policies. But has the damage already been done?
Well, that's a very interesting question. There are 2 dimensions that some damage has been done because it's working through the system now. Right now, there's essentially prohibitive tariffs between the US and China. And that means that trade between these 2 countries is largely going to stop. And inevitably, that's going to do a lot of damage because they, on both sides, notably with China's supplies of manufacturers to the US, there are an enormous number of businesses across the United States that depend on these products. So that's going to be a disruption, and it's going to show itself up in economic activity and retail sales in the US. That's going to have a significant effect. But I think the more important point is the degree of unpredictability and the degree of zaniness of what's happened, introducing these so-called reciprocal tariffs, which weren't reciprocal, on one day and essentially getting rid of them the next for 90 days without anyone knowing what will follow them, for example. Or introducing these obviously not expected massively prohibitive tariffs on China, 145% tariffs and 125% on the other side. People have suddenly realized that sort of anything can happen. Things that they couldn't possibly imagine. It was completely outside their worst nightmares that this is what would happen when Donald Trump became president. After the first term, they didn't experience that. So I think the realization that the range of possible developments of events is so far outside what you thought was possible changes the way you view the future. And inevitably, I think, it's going to make investors who are going to be affected by trade, which is basically anyone in manufacturing, quite a lot of other businesses, very, very nervous about making commitments which they can't walk back. So I think that everybody's going to become very risk averse. That includes allies, potential allies, because they don't know what's going to happen to them. Should they align themselves with the US? Well, maybe that won't work. Look at what has happened to Canada. So I think in this respect, they have broadened the range of possible futures in relationship to the US, still the most important country in the world, beyond anything they could imagine, and that cannot disappear quickly. It will take, I would have thought, a decade or 2 at best before people will say, now we know exactly how the US is going to behave again.
In terms of the economic consequences, Martin, is the real damage at least at this point, 100 days into the Trump administration, is the real damage to the US economy and the US consumer?
I think that that's certainly going to be important. There's no doubt about it. There's a basic proposition in economics, which is still basically true, that the biggest victim of protection, particularly at this sort of level, is your own country. You are imposing massive adjustment shocks on your country by suddenly putting out of reach, more or less, a huge range of goods that they were used to buying. So that's a huge shock, and they have to adjust their spending habits. The firms have to adjust how they structure themselves. That's ineluctable unless it all goes away. And if it all goes away, will they assume that it's all back to normal? I don't know. But of course, because the US is the US, it has imposed tariffs now, significant tariffs by historical standards. It used to be an average of 2% or so. Now it's 10%, leaving aside China and leaving aside, of course, the automobile sector, which has got higher tariffs, and all the other special cases that are being considered. So these all affect other countries. And of course, the effect on China is certainly going to be very, very substantial because it's losing the ability really to export to its biggest single market, if you don't regard Europe as a single market. So there will be damage to China. And then there's a really big question: what does it mean for all the countries that might replace China? Vietnam, for example, other East Asian countries. Is there now going to be a huge opportunity, or is the US going to jack up reintroduce its reciprocal tariffs, 50%, close to 50%, in which case they're going to lose the market? So I think at the moment you'd have to say that everybody is going to feel actually or very close to actually damaged.
And what's that going to look like? Higher prices, fewer jobs?
Well, there will be countries that will...
In the US in particular.
Oh, in the US, yeah.
I mean, what should we be, so to speak, looking forward to in the next couple of years?
Well, I assume that there will be a slowdown in retail sales of consumer goods, which will be really quite significant. It will affect the profits of major US retailing and retail firms significantly, and jobs in those activities. That's sort of the shock effect. There will be a risk factor in investment, above all investment in manufacturing, which will also be significant. So I would expect manufacturing investment to decline too. Will that lead to an actual formal recession? I don't know. I don't have enough expertise on the day-by-day numbers. I think there's an additional factor which is we mustn't underestimate, though how that will play out we don't know, which is the loss of confidence in the US government, and you can see that in the treasuries market, which is the most important market in the world, and the pricing there suggests some real nervousness about the future of stability of US economic policy. And here I think the most important thing will be will there be a war on the Fed? Who's going to be the next Fed chair? What will Trump try to do to get the Fed to do what he wants? So there's going to be a short-term impact on the economy through exports and above all also import availability, and there's going to be bigger concern which will affect investment and I think people's confidence in US financial assets, which is ultimately about confidence in the US government and and the consistency and probity of its policies. So short, medium and long-term effects. How bad it will be, that depends very much on what is decided in the next few months. If in the end the trade war disappears, Trump stops threatening the Fed, everybody thinks, well, they tried that and it was a huge disaster and they've learnt and he's very flexible. He could go away still. But I think the next 2-3 months are going to be very, very important. Do they walk all this back pretty decisively, or do they stick with it, or even play double or quits? We don't know. I don't know whether Mr. Trump knows.
Finally, and that's one of Donald Rumsfeld's unknown unknowns, especially when we get into the head of Donald Trump. Finally, Martin, you're very good at the big picture. A lot of people are talking about this moment as the end of a US-centric economic world order, the demise of the dollar, perhaps the rise of cryptocurrency, obviously the Chinese dimension. Was this two final questions? Firstly, is that true? Are we seeing a reoriented global financial system, America and the dollar no longer being central? And secondly, for all Trump's stupidity, was this in the long run inevitable? I mean, of course, Keynes says in the long run everything's inevitable, including our own deaths, but is this something that we should have expected? It's just all come in a rush, in a mad rush at the beginning of 2025?
Well, these are really difficult questions. I think
that's why I asked you. You're the chief economics commentator of the FT. If you can't answer them, no one can.
Well, let's just say how I think about it. There are two reasons why you could think the world wouldn't continue as it was. The first is the rise of China has genuinely changed the world. And the unipolar moment, it was clearly over, and China is clearly a more credible peer competitor of the US across the board than the Soviet Union ever was. So in that sense, the world that the US comfortably dominated had gone, and it was bound to require something I've written about many times, a forceful alliance strategy by the US, using its web of alliances, which are still so potent, as the basis of its power and influence to maintain anything like that order. So that was the situation. What I don't think was inevitable is that the president who sort of declared the end of the US-led order would also be someone who basically stands not just for America first, but America alone, who has attacked his allies so forcibly. So he has, as it were, taken apart the alliance system and the values that were linked to that, on which I think US leadership was going to depend increasingly in future. So it doesn't seem to me a necessary shock, and a rather strange one if you consciously detonate such an important part of your power. But I suppose it is possible to argue that after 80 years since the war, Second World War, the Americans have just sort of got tired of that world and tired of the responsibilities of that world, and they've sort of got tired with themselves, with the system that they've been living under. That's so obvious. Left and right agree they don't like modern America. Well, once we look at that, then it may be that this was inevitable, but it was inevitable then for reasons that I don't fully understand, and that's probably a failure of my imagination. And the core remains that while America couldn't go on being precisely what it was in the 90s or early 2000s, where they made a bigger mess of it, but they didn't have to jump out of the world and the world they created with this stupendous speed. It's very similar and even more dramatic in its effects when, after the First World War, the Americans repudiated the League of Nations, said Europe's got nothing to do with us, we're just going to leave it, gone. You sort it out, and you know what happened as a result. The Germans elected the Nazis, and the Nazis started conquering the whole of Europe. So it's the American withdrawal so suddenly and so completely, well, complete, that's unfair, but so suddenly, with no obvious strategy to replace it, that seems to me strikingly willful and a little bit mad, and in any case, for me, it's a surprise, and it changes the world.
Well, on that chilling note, Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator of the FT, you've given us much to think about. Martin, thank you so much. This story is only just beginning. We're going to get you back on the show in the not too distant future to explain what comes after America.